Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War Geopolitics news update for the 18th of December 2024, the third news update of the day. I did a live as well, go and check that out with Jonathan Fink, doing a live every day this week in order to drum up some support for the campaign, the Car for Ukraine campaign, which at the moment is going very well. I would plead that you pop along to the link that's in the description to the video below to help that campaign out. We are almost at 40% of the third. So we've done 100% of the first and second trucks, and we're working on a third truck, 40% of the way through that. And that third truck will help out some of the other channels who are struggling to get the fundraising done, because you guys are amazeballs. And this is empirically and objectively true. Okay, let's go to where we're going to start. So that's Australia. I haven't done this in ages. Merry Christmas, Australia. Bloody hoons. Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong has arrived in Kyiv. Look, she's really enjoyed herself out there. It's announced by the ambassador of Ukraine to Australia, Vasil Mirashchik. I mean, bloody hell, I'm not pronouncing that, mate. Struth. Stone to crows. And other Australian fanciful aphorisms. Anyway, Australian Foreign Minister is in Ukraine talking to Ukrainians. Moving on, Zelensky will meet with NATO chief Mark Rutte in Brussels tomorrow. I'm going to do my Belgian accent now. No. The pair are expected to stage a joint press conference afterwards. It's almost impossible to see any major shift on Ukraine's accession bid, says Tim White. Now, that was yesterday. Actually, they have met today, and there's been some. I've actually got it teed up for tomorrow's military aid video, but he has said, Mark Rutte, that they are going to, in fact, I might as well, since I've told you that they've met up, I might as well tell you what they've talked about. So NATO will not only supply weapons to Ukraine, but also purchase Ukrainian-made weapons, said NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. So NATO, I don't know how that works with NATO supplying weapons to Ukraine, but purchasing Ukrainian-made weapons, where that funding is from NATO. I presume that will be NATO nations doing that with the guidance of NATO. NATO won't have the kind of funding to do that themselves. It'd be interesting to see what that really means. He also noted that allies have provided Ukraine with 19 air defense systems to protect critical infrastructure. So that's good news. Now, moving from NATO to the EU, as Anton Gerashenko says, yes, time is of the essence. So bolstering Ukraine right now, says Ursula von der Leyen, is not only a moral obligation, it's also a strategic imperative. The world is watching. Our friends, and even more our foes, will observe carefully how we sustain all our support to Ukraine. It has to be ironclad, she says. And this is absolutely on point. Now, I'm, you know me, I'm up and down with regard to what's going on with support for Ukraine. I think other nations are being very, I think there is this recognition that America could go either way. And as a result, other nations are being stronger in their support. But then, of course, you've got Slovakia and you've got Hungary and so on and so forth. And obviously China waiting in the wings. Now, the UK has said Britain will develop Ukraine's military industry in 2025. London will help Kyiv on the international stage so that support for Ukraine does not stop, according to John Healey, the defence minister. Again, that's really good. So we've got Mark Rutte, we've got Ursula von der Leyen, we've got the UK, we've heard from Poland yesterday. Going to be interesting to see what happens with Germany. Let's assume CDU win, Friedrich Merz comes in. That's looking good. We've had Italy giving another package. We've had Emmanuel Macron and his new government seeming to continue to be in support of Ukraine, but of course that's, well, it's not up in the air if that government can remain consistent, because Macron is there till 2027, and that new government, you've just had elections in France, so there aren't going to be elections for another good few years unless it all goes Pete Tong, or unless it all goes Penny Wong, all goes a bit wrong. I don't know, but let's assume that they're fairly solid. Then you've got the Nordics and the Baltics being really strong in their support for Ukraine. Japan seems to be right. South Korea is possibly coming along more overtly than it was previously. Australia, we just heard from. So, America could be a bit of an outlier. So let's go to America now. Right, Trump's incoming Ukraine envoy, Keith Kellogg, will travel to Kyiv and European capitals in early January to focus on fact-finding and efforts to end the Russia-Ukraine war. He will not visit Moscow on this trip. Good. Now, let's hear from him on Fox News. So this is important because that's Stuart Vardy, isn't it? This is important on Fox News because that's playing to the audience that needs to hear this. Now, there's a couple of fascinating things to pick out from this. First of all, you'll notice this ticker tape at the bottom, this chyron at the bottom, report, Russia losing up to 1,200 troops per day. That's up to 1,200. We've been hearing 1,500. So, make of that what you will. Now, why this is interesting is because you heard Donald Trump in that presser the other day saying, I have been given information that they are losing the same amount of troops as the Russians are in Ukraine. And I excoriated Trump on that press conference. I did a breaking news video. Some of you real pro-Trumpers were like, you can't keep having a go at Trump. I was like, listen to his words. What's interesting here is you've got Keith Kellogg coming out against Trump's words, and this is, I think it's possibly quite subtle, but we've got a report from Fox that they're losing 1,200 troops a day. Now, either Ukraine are losing that many or Ukraine aren't losing that many, and Trump's comments the other day were misplaced. He was wrong, and he was pretty much wrong on everything else he said. I don't think the idea that, we know that Zelensky came out after Trump did a previous interview, the one with Kristen Welker. He had to come out and correct him on the numbers, or give more detail, not correct him, because he came out with some numbers that Zelensky had told him privately. And he came and said something like 400,000 lost. And Zelensky came out and said, right, this many dead and this many injured, wounded. So Trump is saying things that he's not supposed to be saying in public, and he's also saying things that are incorrect, very much incorrect. So the big one I said the other day was when he blamed Biden for the North Korean troops coming into fight for Russia by saying that they reacted to the escalation of the ATACMS being allowed to be shot deeper into Russia, and that was exactly the wrong way round. So Biden allowed the ATACMS restrictions to be lifted precisely because the North Korean troops were fighting in Russia. So Trump empirically got it wrong. There was no universe in which what he said was correct, right? There's just no, it didn't happen. So like that. So Trump was wrong, and he needs to be corrected on this. And I think Keith Kellogg has a much better idea about what is going on, and he's going to go to Kyiv, which is very important. And he's got a very difficult thing to do, which is to correct Trump on where Trump is wrong. And that's going to be also not just on claims of quote unquote facts, but also in kind of ideology and what needs to be done on strategy. This is a really tough gig for him. So yeah, tough gig where I think he has to be doing, in a normal world, you'd just be going to Kyiv, doing fact-finding, finding out what needs to be done, reporting back to the US, reporting back to the administration. You'll work together to get the right thing done for Ukraine and for the US, right, and for the world. Keith Kellogg's got to try to do all of that, knowing that his reporting back, he's fighting against people in his own administration, Elon Musk, and people kind of adjacent to the administration, Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy. Then you've got people like your MAGA senators and representatives who have gone over to the kind of dark side, your Jim Jordans and your Marjorie Taylor Greens and all those kind of people. Okay, they're not in the administration. So he's got Mike Waltz, who may be someone that might have a better grasp of what's going on. But then you've got Tulsi Gabbard, potentially Pete Hegseth, all these other people who are going to be obstacles to Ukraine getting what they need from the US, and the US giving what they should to Ukraine. So there's all sorts of dynamics going on, and that's why it's very hard to predict. And lots of people saying, look, we shouldn't make any predictions until kind of the administration hits the ground, because there are all these kind of different variables. So the problem is, but if we're going to listen to what Trump actually says, then things are looking worrying. And if the reality comes about that something different happens to what Trump says, then Trump is irresponsible. Trump doesn't know what he's talking about. So, if Trump does the right thing, then you have to retrospectively admit that he didn't know what he's talking about previously. I'm going largely on what Trump is saying. And if you're going to convince me it won't happen because they won't do what Trump is saying, then why is Trump saying those things? He's not gaming the system. He is ignorant. He is ignorant because he said precisely the wrong things when they are basic statements of fact, or at least they should be. And so, interesting. Anyway, let's listen to this minute of Keith Kellogg here.
And I really believe that President Trump, who made this promise on the campaign trail, will actually execute this, and it'll come to conclusion, I believe, this year. I think he's got the right capability and ability to do it. So I look forward to it.
By this year, does he mean 2024? Because, that's not going to happen. Clearly, it won't be this year. And will it happen in 24 hours? So I think he's doing a bit of Trump appeasement here.
So you're visiting Kyiv in January, in just a couple of weeks from now.
So that won't be this year. So he's not going to bring it, this is where it gets all a bit weird. Why have you said he's going to bring it about this year and then said, I'm going to go to Kyiv in January next year? Well, it's all done then. It's all sewn up. So I presume he might mean next year.
The main goal of that trip?
Well, I don't want to really report on the trip because that is going to have to come out of the transition team, what I'm going to be doing. But here's what I would say about a trip, or any trip that Steve Witkoff makes as well. This shows the energy of the administration, the new administration, and that President Trump has put people in place to get stuff done. And it shows that we are executing at a rapid tempo before the inauguration and then post-inauguration, because it's kind of an attitude of we're on Trump time and we want to get...
So he's talking about post-inauguration as well. So,
stuff done in a hurry. So I give great credit to President Trump and the new administration that he wants to get things done. And I really believe that...
And then we go on to this claim, and I've just found a video for it while that was going on, a bit of multitasking. So Max24 says, quoting from Kellogg, Russian losses are 5 times higher than Ukraine's losses. Historically, they fight wars of attrition. It was the same in World War II, throwing large numbers of troops at you. Now, that is a direct contradiction of what Trump said, which is they're taking equal casualties. And I find that pretty fascinating. Let's listen to that. And this is Null Report saying Russian losses are 5 times higher than Ukrainian losses, says Trump's special envoy Kellogg. He noted that the wave attacks with massive casualties are typical for Russians, similar to North Koreans. This is a war of attrition.
Stu, this is where you go back to where the Russians fight. There's a great book years ago called Russia at War by Andrew Wirth. And when he kind of said this is how the Russians fight, which is mass warfare, when you use human wave attacks, sort of like the North Koreans are doing right now, you're going to have a huge casualty level. And the casualty levels are around right now with Ukraine and Russia about 5 to 1. That's attrition warfare. And you never wanted to get into an attrition fight with the Russians. It's historically how they fight. That's how they fought in World War II. And they just basically overwhelm you by throwing the amount of troops at you. But then your numbers just go way up. And so you go back to what you said earlier. After 1,000 days of war, with 350 or 400,000 Russian dead, with 150,000...
350,000 to 450,000 Russian dead. That's what Keith Kellogg just said. Let's listen to that again.
1,000 days of war, with 350 or 400,000 Russian dead, with 150,000 Ukrainian dead, or numbers like that.
So he's saying 400,000 Russians dead, 150,000 Ukrainians dead, which is three times, maybe just under 3 times the casualty rates there. Now, that's interesting. And by the way, that is in direct contradiction to what his boss has said.
Both sides are saying, okay, maybe this is time we need to step back. Look at the casualties.
Stu, what I would like is someone like Varney here to go, okay, that's really interesting you said that, because I just heard the other day Trump say something completely different. They are not singing off the same song sheet here. I have much more. I think Keith Kellogg has much more credibility, and I have much more credence in what he is saying than Trump, and that needs to be sorted out. You cannot have the leader of a nation be so fast and loose with facts or with. If what he is saying is factual, then it is counter to the narrative that needs to be presented. That Keith Kellogg there is either, so one of them's lying, and one of them I think is more responsible than the other. So even if Keith Kellogg is lying, that's because it's in line with the US strategy and information on OPSEC, although I don't think he is lying, but I'm just giving you the other side. The other option is that Trump is telling the truth, but then should he be saying that in public, etc., etc. So there are just big problems here. Now, Mick Ryan here is, he's actually quoted, he's a retired Australian general. He's quoting New York Times here. In something that is slightly worrying. So since Mr. Trump's win, says the New York Times, the ultra-conservative wing of the party has been emboldened in its demands to ice Ukraine out of the US funding altogether, meaning the political price of promoting war aid is getting steeper. In other words, before there was quite a lot of bipartisan support. So during the previous session, you had the appropriations bill eventually got through. The 7 months of impasse wasn't because there were people in the Senate or indeed the House of Representatives who were anti-Ukraine and weren't going to pass a bill. It was Mike Johnson doing the behest of Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump wanted that bill put on pause for 7 months or indefinitely. It happened for 7 months, eventually got through. And when it got through, it got voted on with a pretty decent bipartisan support, which means that in general, the Republican lawmakers are supportive of Ukraine. What is being said here is that now that those MAGA who were against it at the time and didn't vote for it have become a louder party, the louder part of the party. Indeed, they are now the party. This is what people are saying. Is that Mitt Romney said this the other day, that MAGA is now Republican Party. It is Trump's party. So that loud MAGA brash kind of anti-Ukraine stance is now one that these other people feel even more pressure to be beholden to. And you might not get the bipartisan support, even if something did come to the floor, which I doubt it. I don't think Mike Johnson is going to do that. But even if it did come to the floor, there would be a lot of pressure on people who would otherwise vote for support for Ukraine. There'd be a lot of pressure on them not to vote for that aid. Now, Anton Gerashchenko here says, Federal Minister for Economic Affairs and Climate Action Robert Habeck from Germany says, quote, "It was an epic historical miscalculation to build our prosperity on the promise of eternal friendly relations with Putin." So this is, I guess, going back to Angela Merkel's time. She's just brought out her own memoirs and sort of giving her views on how things went. But there's a lot of criticism now of the previous German government saying that actually there was too much dependence on Russian hydrocarbons, too much trust in Putin, too much thought about and I know you guys reminded what it is, Frankel von Hankel, Franden von Handen, the two German words which basically means, change through trade type thing. The approach of the previous German government was, we will change Putin by taking him into our inner circle and trade with him. The globalism that he'll be a part of will be what changes him to be more like us. And that didn't work. Now, I've actually always given her a bit of sympathy here, because it's easy to cast opinions with perfect 2020 hindsight. When we look back, we go, oh, she was an idiot, oh my god, look at what she did, and now look at where Germany is. If you're at the time and you think, well, actually Putin could change, and he at the beginning of his rule, he was looking like he could be the liberal kind of he could be exactly what the rest of the world needed and what Russia needed. There was genuine calculation that he was going to be the change. And then he was also offering cheap hydrocarbons. So you're Germany going like, I think we could change him, and we're getting really freaking cheap oil and gas here. Like, that's going to be beneficial for your country. Now, it turns out that he didn't do that, and the calculation was incorrect. But I think it's easy to really go hard on blaming people for that. I'm not trying to say I'm some massive Angela Merkel fan, but you've got to put yourself in those people's shoes to understand why they made the decisions they did. They aren't going, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take a massive risk and screw our country over, but over in 10 years' time at the moment, just to make some quick bucks. Like, yeah, okay, you might think like that, but I think there was some genuinely pretty rational thought that went into why they did that. What the variable that was not well predicted was Putin himself. Like, he just ended up, and possibly he became more like this. It wasn't that he was that person originally, but actually throughout time he was getting more and more power and more money. The idea is that he's the richest man in the world. He was taking like 50% of the turnover of like Gazprom and all these kind of previously nationalized industries that the oligarchs had got hold of, but actually he's the ultimate oligarch. And as time went on, he was getting more power and more money, and that kind of maybe that rotted him from the inside, and he has now become this dictator that wasn't able to be tamed by the allure of democracy, of globalism, of international trade. So now you've got Habeck here saying, you know, it was an epic historic miscalculation to build our prosperity on a promise of eternal friendship with Putin. Your faith in Germany's export model was a miscalculation. As the third biggest economy in the world, 50% of our growth was based on exports. He said, no other country had this. Yes, we're a big beneficiary of globalization, but we are especially, what did he say at the end there? We were especially vulnerable when globalization began to falter. Yeah, well, has globalization faltered? Yeah, I guess there is a growing sense of autocracy around the world. So it's democracy that seems to have faltered, and people are now encamping in their kind of little groups or on their own, or in America possibly wanting to isolate. Yeah, but I think that miscalculation is largely just Putin himself. So yes, it was a miscalculation, but I'm not sure I would. Yeah, we can blame Merkel for that, but it's understandable why she made that decision, I think. But feel free to attack me. Zelensky has said, I insist that no leader in the world has the right to negotiate with Putin without Ukraine. He's talking about Viktor Orban. We have never delegated this mandate to anyone. We are victims. It would be unfair if everyone started talking about how the country should live. Absolutely on point there. I'm wondering if I've got it. Have I got it here? Is this the one? This might be. Yes, so that's probably a better time to have this tweet, which was Viktor Orban responding to Ukrainska Pravda in English. So Ukrainska Pravda merely reporting Zelensky saying Orban has no leverage over Putin. Who else in Europe has such experience as Ukraine? No one. Does Orban have such an army? No. How would he put pressure on Putin? Blah, blah, blah. I reported that the other day. Orban has replied to that. We will not respond to any provocation. There is a ceasefire proposal on the table. Take it or leave it. It's your responsibility. Of course, that ceasefire is going to be firmly supportive of Russia and their agenda. So this is a growing sense of a chasm between Viktor Orban and Ukraine and its allies. It's going to be interesting to see where this goes. He is getting less and less popular in his own country. The opposition party of Peter Magyar has grown more popular in the latest polls again than his own Fidesz party. The elections are in 2026, so they can't come soon enough, but there is enough time for him to rig those elections. I would imagine a very similar situation to Georgian Dream and Georgia, and if that does happen, then they'll have to be kicked out of the EU because they'll just be failing in free and fair elections. But that's where I see that going. Same can be said about Slovakia, and we'll come on to speak about Slovakia in a minute. So Ukraine, according to Politico, is studying European models of electoral legislation, including electronic voting, with the aim of holding elections soon after the end of the war. Zelensky's mentioned this a couple of times, that there will be elections as soon as the war finishes. Be interesting to see if he runs and what happens, and whether he'll be as popular, whether he would be able to eke out a victory there, or whether people would be war weary, even of Zelensky, who has done, I think, an amazing job. But there might be a clamour for change. Peace talks Peace talks with Russia are only possible when Moscow runs out of resources, according to Andriy Yermak from the presidential office. Quote, real negotiations for a lasting peace will begin when the enemy no longer has the resources to continue the war, Andriy Yermak said yesterday, according to the Kyiv Independent. I don't think they are going to be too interested in negotiating unless they are properly backs against a wall. And that's why it's incumbent upon allies to provide Ukraine with as much help as possible so that they can start the negotiations on the battlefield and start getting the upper hand there. Christopher Miller from Financial Times says, Zelensky has said to French News, quote, Trump knows about my desire not to rush to the detriment of Ukraine. In other words, he doesn't want to rush to negotiations that won't be favourable for Ukraine. Continuing, the country has long been fighting for its sovereignty. No matter how many presidents or prime ministers want to declare an end to the war, we are not going to just give up and surrender our independence. This is very interesting in that seems to be a kind of a sort of polite rebuttal or a rebuke of Donald Trump there. It's like, it doesn't matter how many presidents say, and Viktor Orban, that we are going to have peace and negotiations. You know, we don't want to rush into this. We've been fighting for our sovereignty for a long enough time. We've lost enough lives to know what's on the line and to know that we're serious about this. But we have to have a just and lasting peace. On the other hand, Robert Fico says Ukraine will not receive an invitation to NATO. It will lose a third of its territory. So Robert Fico is saying, being very positive for Ukraine, of course. I mean, he is an absolute... I don't know why Suggs from Madness is at the moment in the international political scene, but so be it. Our house is in the middle of the street, it turns out. And for those who don't know their British music, you'll be wondering what the hell I'm talking about. Okay, Robert Fico, brackets Suggs. Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico is to discuss gas transit through Ukraine with the EU chief. Slovakia currently imports 3 billion cubic meters of gas per year through Ukraine from Russia's energy giant Gazprom. So they're still wanting to get that transit, even though Ukraine have said they're not going to continue the contract past 2024. And of course, that means Slovakia desperately needs some alternative. Now, I talked to you about how Slovakia appears to be pretty divided in terms of, general sympathy for Ukraine, with the Fico government getting in, that coalition getting in, and then opening the floodgates to Russian disinformation. And that really screws things up. And I said that I met Rob at the talk I gave in Stockbridge some months back. And he had a Czechoslovakian wife, and I said she was born in Czechoslovakia, but she's Slovakian. Actually, he said no, she's Czech. And actually, Rob has replied. So this is absolutely fantastic. Thanks, Rob, for this. So hi, ATP Geo. So great to meet you at your talk. We thoroughly enjoyed it. Denise is from the Czech side of the former Czechoslovakia. The situation is bad there because I remember I was telling you her family were victim to disinformation themselves. I think her grandmother. Anyway, she goes on to talk about this. Lots of disinformation. Both countries suffer from a Russian-leaning older generation indoctrinated by the SU and Soviet Union, and potentially the younger generation in Slovakia isn't quite as pro-West as in Czech. So that's Slovakia. So there is a bit of a difference between Czechia and Slovakia. It was great back then. Putin is great now. What about gulags, work camps, etc.? Well, yes, that's all bad, but that didn't affect me. Generally, that's the point. Even being owned and controlled by Russia wouldn't affect them in their mind. But war with Russia would, and it's much better to accept the inevitable than to fight it. And not to mention, what about Zelensky's ex-billion-pound super yacht, supercars, depopulation agendas, Europeans being replaced with Ukrainians, all the kind of Russian propaganda that has been spread about Zelensky and about Ukraine. Even every conspiracy you can imagine is shared and truly believed, and that's what's worrying. We talked about disinformation on my live stream with Andrew Mikado and Jonathan Fink. I really enjoyed this afternoon's live stream. I enjoy all the live streams I do, but that was really a fertile ground for discussion today. And if you haven't checked that out, there was a lot of stuff we got into talking about how to change minds, the power of disinformation, and the power of online social media outlets for platforming disinformation. etc., etc. Go and check out that live stream from earlier today. They've also been fed for the past 10 plus years, says Rob, many anti-EU talking points at the same as all the same Brexit talking points you saw in the UK. It's really word for word identical lies about contributions, immigrants, etc. The Russians really got their money's worth on the media campaigns, and this is, I've long said, Russia underwrote the Brexit campaign in the same way they were meddling in the 2016 elections in the US. They were meddling in Brexit. We know this; it's empirically true. The social media campaigns, social media platforms have come out and admitted this, Twitter and Facebook and so on and so forth. And the British government refused to release a report on it because they knew that it would undermine the Brexit election results. And the Conservative government at the time was wanting to, eventually to celebrate, Boris Johnson, etc., wanted Brexit to go through. They campaigned on Brexit. So they didn't do a report, or they didn't release a report on how Russia had interfered with the Brexit campaign. We need that report out. We need honesty and truth. If they had negligible effect, okay, but we need to know that officially. The only reason you would hide that report is because it would have had more significant effect on the Brexit vote and the Brexit campaign than you would like to admit. So this is what's happening, and that happened in 2016, and 8 years later we are seeing those same talking points and the same mechanisms being utilized by Russia in places like Slovakia and Hungary. If they can peel Hungary and Slovakia away from the EU, they can stop Serbia wanting to get into the EU and foment ultra-nationalist discord in these places in Eastern Europe, then my goodness, Russia are doing their job. Like I said to you, they should never have invaded Ukraine. They could have had much more effect on the political outcome of Europe by spending all the money that they've spent on the war on troll farms and bot farms and AI bots, just absolutely ruining the political discourse right across Europe and the wider world. They're good at that. They do it really, really well. Okay, the UN passed a resolution on human rights violations in the occupied parts of Ukraine. For the first time during the war, the document accuses Russia of a, quote, war of aggression. It also calls on Russia to withdraw all its armed forces from Ukrainian territory. Now, this is on the one hand, this is really good. The UN finally actually saying, after 3 years of war, saying what needs to be said, at least to some degree, about the war in Ukraine. However, 14 voted against, and we can look at those countries. They are all the countries you'd expect. In fact, let's look at them. Belarus, obviously. Burkina Faso, Burundi, what other ones? Eritrea, Mali and Niger, and Sudan, and Zimbabwe. All those African countries right across the Sahel region and countries where the Russians have their fingers in the pies. Then you've got Cuba, North Korea, China voting against this, Iran, obviously, Russia, Nicaragua as well. So, okay, that's to be expected. Watch out for Africa. It is becoming more and more pro-Russian. What depresses me are the abstentions, right? We'd expect those votes against, although it does seem quite a few of them, but it's the abstentions. Obviously, Brazil's going to be in there, but there's a lot of countries that I would like to see on that list. A lot of other African countries who abstained. Serbia, unsurprisingly, but then you got Saudi Arabia, Yemen, a lot of countries that also probably have nefarious influence from Russia and maybe China. St. Kitts, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, these, you're thinking, really? Philippines is a letdown because of the connections to America there. Yeah, just good news that that's got through. Bad news that were a lot of abstentions to that. Now, I'm going to come to that in a little while. We're just going to go on to, I've talked a lot about how is America sliding towards autocracy, and one of the ways that you get autocracy is a obedience in advance. This is what Timothy Snyder talks about on Tyranny on Ukraine, his great book. His chapter 1 was on obeying in advance. So I talked about ABC News getting $15 million in payments to Trump. You've got Jeff Bezos. You have the guy that runs OpenAI, and you've got and Mark Zuckerberg all giving $1 million to Trump's inauguration. You are having people genuflect to Trump, and there's a control of the media that I think is deeply, deeply worrying in the United States. Edward Hunter Christie, referencing the Financial Times article, Musk giving serious thought to donating to Reform UK, says Nigel Farage. I've talked about this previously. This is super worrying. So that the new Rupert Murdoch, he will decide how English-speaking countries vote. He'll also control certain key technology and defence industrial issues, and the national budget issues too. The father of my partner's daughter's daughter. So as I've told you, we've got a little baby in the house now, and it's been absolutely wonderful. And the father was just around. In fact, I think he's still here. And I was talking to him about this, and he was talking about how Musk, controls X, Y, and Z. But I was letting him know about the sheer volume of satellites that guy has, and we were just talking about how it is Bond villain-esque, the power he has, the contracts he has with NASA, with the Department of Defense. He's unelected, but in the middle of the White House, supposedly in charge of making swinging $2 trillion cuts to the government, while also taking on contracts, while also advocating for tax cuts for the rich, while also using his influence abroad, having phone calls with Iran, having phone calls with etc., etc., etc. And he is possibly paying money into the UK political system to enforce a political change there. He's used Twitter to enforce political change in America. He's used Twitter to get his own political agenda across the world in countries. Brazil stood up to him and he actually capitulated, but how many other countries are not standing up to him? The EU is looking at trying to regulate Twitter because of the amount of disinformation and manipulation from nefarious third-party state actors like Russia and China, Iran and North Korea. This is a guy with unbridled power that we've never seen this power in the history of Earth, right? This, especially in a modern era. This guy has insane power, and I think it's more problematic power than like the raw military power of someone like Hitler. This is a guy that can invade people's minds, no matter where they live in the world. He can affect people in a way kind of almost more fundamental than, say, Hitler. Like someone living in I don't know, Brazil or maybe Australia wasn't as affected by Hitler as potentially by Elon Musk, who controls if he got a monopoly of satellites and then controlled global communication, the power this guy has is deeply worrying. Interesting that, do you remember the Des Moines Register and Ann Seltzer in the run up to the US elections? She had an outlier of a poll. I reported it as like, this is amazing. This poll is like completely different from the others. Shows actually that Trump's in a lot of trouble here in Iowa, and that's bucking a trend. And she's got a really good form for polls. Now it turns out that poll was an outlier. It was just statistically anomalous, which is what you get every so often. I mean, that's almost predictable in that it will happen at some point, especially when you do raw polling data like that. She didn't weight her data, and it worked in all the previous times really well, but it was an outlier then. Now, what's not cool here is that Trump is trying to sue her like he tried to sue ABC and George Stephanopoulos, trying to sue the Des Moines Register. So he's suing the paper because he's still mad about an election poll he didn't like, says a New Republic. The paper isn't standing for it though, so they are fighting back in a way that we didn't see ABC and Disney do, a way we didn't see Jeff Bezos do with the Washington Post, that we didn't see Mark Zuckerberg do, that we haven't seen OpenAI do. These people are paying fealty. Des Moines Register is much smaller local paper saying, no, screw you. We're standing up. We're not being bullied by an autocrat wannabe, and I find that really interesting. Now we're going to do a Vatnik soup here on Scott Horton. If you remember, Scott Horton was on with Wesley Clark, retired General Wesley Clark, who's associated with the Institute for the Study of War, I think, and had been involved in NATO and lots of high-powered conversations and agreements and treaties and whatnot. Scott Horton is this kind of conservative libertarian who's all anti-Ukraine, essentially. And they were on Piers Morgan, and I did a reaction video to that, which I really enjoyed doing. And I think Wesley Clark spanked Scott Horton, and rightly so, because he was just full of arse. Apt. Actually, there was and I still haven't finished the video, but Piers Morgan brought them on the next day to continue the debate, and I really do need to finish that. Anyway, Pekka Kallioniemi's done a Vatnik Super with Scott Horton, the author of Unprovoked, so let's go through that. I'll introduce an American radio host and propagandist, Scott Horton. He's best known for blaming Russia's genocidal war on Ukraine and on the US, so the John Mearsheimer realist, like, let's blame NATO expansionism, that kind of thing, and for publishing a 700-page book full of Kremlin propaganda. And most of you probably remember Scotty from the recent episode on Piers Morgan Uncensored, so it wasn't just with General Wesley Clark. There was also Anna Pavskova, who I've interviewed twice, and I think she's on Jonathan Thinks' Silicon Curtain tomorrow. He recorded that today. Anyway, in which he was schooled for his revisionist propaganda by Ukrainian volunteer and activist Anastasia. Now, she was saying, look, I'm a Russian-speaking Ukrainian who was involved in Euromaidan, and you are talking bollocks. Like, you are saying that this was all arranged by X, Y, and Z. I was there. I was, as a young person, protesting against all these things that we know to be true. Because I'm telling you, I was there. The truth is how I felt and why I was protesting. You can say that this was all like McCain and Newland and whoever. Like, I was there. This is why we were protesting. And this is why all of us who were protesting. Yeah. And she, I think, was excellent on that. So let's start with the obvious. Scott Horton is a hardcore Kremlin apologist who sees nothing wrong with what Putin does, but strongly condemns anything that Ukrainians do to defend themselves. For Horton, the enemy is the US and all of its allies. The way this works is that whenever Scotty talks about a historical event, he somehow flips it so that the fault lies with the US. And he's been doing that for a long time. He's conducted over 5,000 interviews since 2003 for various stations, including his own anti-war radio. Horton is an editorial director of antiwar.com, a website that claims to be devoted to non-interventionism, but it's somehow full of rambles from Kremlin apologists. It's promoted by John Mearsheimer, John Waters, and Scott's predecessor praised Putin as a patriot. Scotty is part of the US Kremlinitarian movement and so-called Mises Caucus, a pro-Kremlin group who hijacked the real libertarians to help with Trump's re-election. By the way, Mises is you got von Hayek and Mises. These are Austrian economists from the real kind of libertarian free market enterprise, absolute, like the real other end of free market capitalism. So that's where they fit in, just in case you didn't know who Mises and Mises Institute are. A pro-Kremlin group who hijacked the real libertarians to help with Trump's re-election. He's referred to as their foreign policy guy. The group's led by Angela McArdle, and then he's done a Vatnik Soup on Angela McArdle previously, so we won't go into her. Horton's anti-war stance, and by the way, there are lots of different receipts, if you like, for each of the claims he makes. I'm not going through them all at the moment because I'm kind of rushing through this one, but you can go and check the full thread out itself with all the receipts. Horton's anti-war stance seems to be that countries like Russia can invade other sovereign nations, whereas their victims' allies should not be able to help in any way because that would provoke or escalate. This crowd sometimes does condemn murderers like Putin and Assad, but then comes the but. I'm not racist, but okay, you're going to say something racist now, aren't you? Like, yeah, Putin is the aggressor, but okay, here it comes. But here's how it was actually our own faults, and Putin had to invade Ukraine because they wanted to integrate into EU and NATO, and it was the US who meddled in Ukraine's domestic issues and not Putin, shifting the blame from the Kremlin. In this worldview, one bag of low grade, and there's an example there, but this is Scott Horton saying on Twitter, Obama and Biden overthrew the government in Kyiv in 2014, of course, note the spelling of Kiev. The new regime immediately attacked the Donbass and has been killing people there ever since. Calls the democratically elected government a regime, and then accuses them of attacking people in Donbass when the Russians invaded the Donbass with little green men. You absolute wingnut dingbat. Nah. In this worldview, one bag of low-grade cookies and a phone call between two Americans somehow constitutes a coup and provokes or justifies a genocidal invasion, whereas the arming and training of separatists and dioxin poisoning of the Kremlin's puppets opponent is just bad sushi. So remember, you've got the then Ukrainian leader being poisoned. That's his face as a result of the dioxin poisoning from the Kremlin. But that's all right in Scott Horton's book, right? Quite literally. And that's exactly what Scotty's new book is titled, Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War and Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. With Russia and the catastrophe in Ukraine. And that's what it's all about. He shifts all the blame of the Russia-Ukraine war on Obama and Biden and claims that Russia simply had to invade. So there you go. Horton falsely claims that the US spent $100 million on the coup in Ukraine, but to my knowledge never explained why massive months-long anti-Yanukovych and pro-EU protests erupted all over Ukraine in freezing temperatures, even in Donbass and Crimea. On Pearce's show, Scott was trying to be a bit more careful with his words, but the Vatnik-friendly judge Napolitano, is not an ice cream. He parrots all the classic Kremlin narratives. US-sponsored 2014 Ukraine coup d'etat. The West wanted the war to happen, and Ukraine is full of Nazis. So he says exactly what he feels in certain places where he feels safer to say so. According to Scotty, Putin decided to invade Crimea as a reaction to Obama's illegal Ukrainian coup of 2014. He also claimed that Russia took Crimea without firing a single shot and somehow suggests that the move wasn't aggression. Truly a libertarian anti-war figure. Like Crimea gave themselves up to Russia, of course, didn't they? Russia didn't just move in their armed forces and physically take it over in very much a non-libertarian way. Scott Horton, you prime dingbat. As Obama said after Putin took Crimea in reaction to his illegal Ukrainian coup of 2014, says Scott Horton on Twitter, Bush had more than 100,000 troops in Iraq when Putin invaded Georgia in reaction to Saakashvili's illegal attack on South Ossetia in 2008. And Obama had more than 100,000 in Afghanistan in 2014. So he's justifying Georgia, he's justifying all the wrong ones. Anyway, and the US does a colour-coded coup in any state in Russia's orbit. Russia took Crimea without firing a single shot. Some aggression. Scott Horton is just a Putin appeaser. He was one of the speakers and sponsors at the Rage Against the War Machine anti-war event in DC in February 2023, featuring warmongers like Jackson Hinkle and Tara Reid. The event demands were a Putin's wish list of ending aid to Ukraine and disbanding NATO and somehow abolishing war and empire, naturally suggesting total capitulation of the defender without calling for the aggressor to cease hostilities and remove their army from occupied territory is hardly an anti-war stance. It's actually a sign of support for imperialism as pro-war as you can get. What a brilliant point! I love the way that Pekka Kalyanemi has phrased that. So when these anti-war people say it's all the US's fault, blah, 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 what they're doing is facilitating imperialism. They're actually facilitating overt war and aggression. There's nothing anti-war about it when you are justifying Russia invading Donbass, Crimea, and Ukraine in general and blaming it all on the US. You're just saying you're fine to do that, Russia. You can do that, and I'll even support you by saying it's all America's fault under the guise of being anti-war. Absolutely disgusting. Like a good Kremlin lapdog, Scotty has been promoting Russia's new superweapon, Oreshnik, blaming Joe Biden for escalating the war by allowing Ukraine to hit legitimate military targets inside Russia with long-range missiles such as ATACMS, which aren't long-range, by the way, they're medium-range. And we could, look at another Scott Horton tweet here. At first, I was kind of bummed out that all these major developments happened with the ATACMS and Oreshnik missiles, further intervention in Georgia, and now the creation of a whole new caliphate in Syria, all happening right after the book was finally done. But who am I kidding? It would have been another 50 pages at least. Got it right under the wire, in fact. It's all the same kind of thing for him. Scotty also has a funny way of ignoring all the human rights violations in Russia, and he's, for example, called Washington Post's report on torture and persecution of ethnic and sexual minorities CIA propaganda. He also has a hard time believing the genocide against Ukrainians. And Scott Horton here says the CIA post is full of babies on bayonets already. Putin is going to round up and torture all the gays. Well, actually, Putin has rounded up and tortured all sorts of people, and he's just trying to minimize that. He then goes on to say, if 300 dead civilians is genocide, then I'm really looking forward to Clinton W. Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, all the other cabinets' upcoming criminal trials? Or does it have to be exactly 300? 1,000 times more each still counts? Well, and that's talking about the Times of Israel, talking about actually Butcher, what we know happened in Butcher. So he's saying that that's not genocide. So Butcher isn't genocide because there was only 300 people that were killed there, 300 civilians. Well, no, he's understanding intentions and what you would like to do to the whole of the population if they were all there in that same place. Would the same have happened to everyone? Or was it just Butcher? They were just against Butcher. It was only people in Butcher they didn't like. The rest of Ukraine is absolutely fine, and we wouldn't have touched them at all. It's only, but I hate people from Butcher. Ooh, Butcher. No, it was the Ukrainians. So that is genocidal, you absolute idiot again. Ugh. So Pekka carries on. Actually, we even had a hard time believing in Russia's full-scale invasion just a week before it actually happened, a classic among alleged Wagner experts. He looked so proud in a video when he could say it on live television, which is talking down the threat of invasion and saying it's not going to happen. Of course, then it happened. As is tradition, Horton's takes on Syria are just as bad as his takes on Ukraine and Russia. He claims that Assad's sarin attacks against his own people were hoaxes, and he's even suggested that Assad is probably a better leader for Syria than al-Jolani. Considering that Horton claims to absolutely despise Nazis, it's strange that he's decided to befriend and work with one of the US's biggest Nazi apologists, Daryl Cooper, martyr maid. Scott and Daryl were at one point even supposed to author Provoked together. I have a hard time understanding why Piers Morgan has decided to add Horton as a regular panelist, but it probably has something to do with getting better ratings through rage baiting. I mean, he also platforms Vatniks like Sachs, Benny Johnson and George Galloway. Interestingly, Scott's wife, Larissa Alexandrovna, and I mentioned this before, is a Ukrainian who has a much less glamorous picture of Russia. Quote, Russian occupation is worse than death. Let's not forget that Russia has starved Ukraine and committed mass genocide on purpose. Nobody wants to live like that, she has said, while her husband says something completely different. To conclude, Horton is as anti-war as Putin, and his only argument seems to be a US bad. For some reason, he's invited by the media to discuss ongoing conflicts, even though he defends authoritarian states like Russia and Assad Syria and lacks any actual expertise. And this is a great thing. Anastasia was saying, look, I speak Russian. You've never been to Ukraine. You've written a 700-page book. And Wesley Clark was saying, I was involved in those NATO meetings. I was there. You weren't. Like, shut up. You don't know. I'm paraphrasing, but it's kind of like, shut up. You don't know what you're talking about. And that's basically how I see it. This is Jake Bro in a Contradictions with him. So, Scott Horton, be very wary of him. He is a Vatnik. And I'm now going to go. It's been very long, this one. Do apologise. I'm going to go, and because I have so much free time, right, we are campaigning, remember, for trucks for Ukraine, car for Ukraine. Here we have, where are we at the moment? $23,752. Well, that's a great campaign. I've been doing my own campaign. I got a board game, Sherman Leader, a solo board game where I'm involved in a World War II battle. And I used to be cool. I used to go out for drinks. I used to be gregarious, fun at parties. I used to never say no to like going out and having good times, traveling around the world, all that kind of crazy stuff. And at some point in my life, I became just an unadulterated geek. And now talk about geopolitics on endlessly on the internet. And then occasionally find some time to play a board game with myself, because that's how cool I am. But at least I have a cup of tea there. Anyway, you'll be happy to know that I won that particular first opening battle, and it's all right. So happy days for them. 1942 out in North Africa, just in case you were wondering. Take care, guys. Speak to you soon. Please help out with the campaign. Toodle pips.